Now, the critical and memorable flood account suggests how God could eliminate all the evil that's obstructing His world. But it culminates in God deciding to reject the total annihilation of all living things. In Genesis 8, He says, "I will never again curse the ground on account of man." And of course, we all know that He puts the rainbow into the sky to remind man of this promise that He has a covenant with them, that He will not destroy them through a flood again. But the flood's evocative description, the ark full of animals, coming in 2 by 2, the 40 days, the 40 nights of rain, the dove returning with an olive leaf in her mouth, the rainbow, all of this reminds us of one of the most powerful and removing stories that's ever been told. And indeed, you can't really understand a lot of our culture without understanding some of these. They're used metaphorically all the time. If I offer someone an olive branch, for example, that means that I'm trying to make peace with them, for example, okay? So many of these evocative images and metaphors come from this story. Now, all of this reminds us of God's mercy in saving humanity and of the close relationship of humanity to the animals. So like Noah, we are their caretakers. Noah has to save all the animals because God could have saved them Himself, but He gave Noah the arduous task of building a gigantic ship to save all of the animals, which indicates that human beings are to care for the animals much the way Adam was supposed to do. And in fact, there are many, many parallels between Adam and Noah is somewhat like a second Adam, okay? Now, it does raise the question, why didn't God just wipe out all evil and just be done with it? God could bring an end to His creation if He wants, but even Noah himself is not a perfect guy. He's not completely sinless. Later on, there's an account in Genesis 9 about him becoming drunk and uncovering his nakedness, essentially doing something that was shameful. And so later on, Noah is, caught in such an episode, but Noah is found to be a preacher in the early days before the flood. He's preaching the law, or preaching God's law, and telling people to repent and to follow God. And so God decides to choose Noah to save humanity. So He mercifully saves Noah plus 7 others, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives, to replenish the earth and to restore humanity. After the flood subsides and the ark lands on Mount Ararat, God establishes a new covenant with Noah and gives him new laws to establish and to enforce. And God commands them, like Adam and Eve, to be fruitful and to multiply. So Noah effectively becomes the new Adam at this point. All of humanity will branch out from him through his 3 sons, and he will, he saves the animals and tend the earth. He becomes a gardener and so forth, much like Adam. And so the new rainbow is going to become this reminder of God's covenant to never again destroy the earth and mankind with water. And so the flood account has all these memorable episodes in it. And then his 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, will then go out to repopulate the earth after the flood. Chapter 10 will explain how each of them have many descendants, and that those descendants spread out over the ancient world and will become the founders of many nations and people groups. But a new problem is going to emerge. And this is the problem that arises known as the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. Because all the peoples at that time, all the descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, they all spoke the same language, there was not much they couldn't accomplish. When human beings can all speak the same language, they can do far more because they can collaborate and cooperate. But they decided to do something that was outside the bounds of what God had commanded them to do. God had commanded them to spread out around the world, but many of them had decided to gather on the plain of Shinar, which is in Iraq, somewhere in the Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent there. We're not sure exactly where. But they decided to build a huge city so that they could become famous. and they were going to do this by building an enormous tower. So God disapproved of this, of their disobedience and their desire for fame that brings power. So it's primarily political power and fame that was the root motivation for this tower. God simply dispersed them to the far reaches of the earth by confusing their language into many languages. And so they showed up one day for work and to build the tower and to build the city, and lo and behold, they couldn't understand each other because they were speaking different languages. And so this broke up the power and forced them to disperse. Paul, in the book of Acts, says, He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God. And so here Paul is explaining what happened in the Tower of Babel episode. Now, Hebrew scholar Ken Matthews, in his commentary on Genesis in the New American Commentary series, which I highly recommend, he says on the Babel narrative that, quote, the story provides a striking contrast between human opinion of its self-achievements and God's viewpoint of such endeavors. Human cooperation, when it is fueled by autonomy and directed towards self-interest, is shown by the story to be shallow, impotent hubris, end quote. Now, the rest of Genesis is no less remarkable than these few narratives that we've looked at already. Chapters 12 through 50 present the account of Abraham and Isaac, Abraham and Sarah, and then Isaac their son, Jacob, and finally Joseph, the long Joseph narrative. Genesis 12 through 50, the narratives about Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, and about the 12 sons of Jacob explain the formation of the Israelites and the Hebrews. So that's what you get in the book of Genesis. You get kind of the prehistory there with the creation of the world, Adam and Eve, then Noah and the flood, and then Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And then starting in chapter 12, you get Abraham and the beginning of the Hebrew nation all the way through to Joseph. Okay. Now, when God called Abraham, He said that in you all the families of the earth will be blessed, and gave him that promise in Genesis 12. And so one of the things that we can understand from looking at the kind of the Old Testament theology is that Israel was meant to be, coming from Abraham, was meant to be a blessing to all peoples of the world. So in the creation of Israel, God creates a people set aside for His service, who were charged with revealing their knowledge of God to others. And so they had a kind of a duty to reach out to the rest of humanity. These men and women were not perfect. In fact, we see many of their sins recorded, and all of them have foibles and problems and so forth. So it isn't mere propaganda. If it was propaganda, it would not contain some of these embarrassing episodes. For example, if the Old Testament was simply Jewish propaganda, we wouldn't have the embarrassing stories about, for example, David and some of his exploits. Okay, the fact that those are recorded tells us that this was not just simply a propaganda. Now, many of these Old Testament patriarchs and others failed, even morally. Moses for himself is going to have great failure. But by God's guidance and provision, they learned and recorded a lot of spiritual wisdom that they had gained from God to pass on to others. Now, the remarkable story of Joseph reveals a wise and forgiving man, one who reconciles and restores broken relationships. We see this in the last 5 chapters of Genesis. His life leads to the story of the Exodus, another epic story. After the famine, a famine forces all the Israelites to move to Egypt. And so Genesis takes you right up to the end there with Joseph, and then Exodus begins with Moses and the Exodus story of him leading them out of slavery in Egypt.